Welcome back to Project Hippocampus. If you haven't seen the video detailing the specifics of this project, I'd really suggest checking that out before watching this one. It's the first video in this playlist and is linked in the description. Timestamps for each tale will also be in the description. In this video, I'll be telling 5 tales from the time of abandonment, which spanned from 1 YBA to about 40 YAA. Without further ado, let's begin our first tale. The Tale of the Final Race. Finnish ran as much to chase the thoughts from his head as he did for the joy of hoof on turf. Worry snapped at his tail with invisible fangs, its growls louder than the hoofbeats of the other racehorses. It wasn't even Finish's own worry that troubled him. His jockey was more worried than ever before. Finish could feel it in the way she held the reins, and it scared him. It was natural to be nervous before a race, of course, but this was excessive. Every jockey seemed nervous, and it was affecting every horse. Burnished Gold had begun to snake his head and neck at Finish earlier before his jockey had jerked the reins, but then they had never gotten along anyway. No sooner had Finish begun thinking about Burnished Gold than he saw a familiar white muzzle creeping up on his right. Finish's jockey's heel squeezed quickly on his flank, and he sped up almost automatically. They had been racing together for so long that he barely even thought about it. The crowd yelled out, and the exceptional sharpness of their voices would have flattened Finish's ears if they weren't down already. What was wrong with all of the humans? The worry ran closer behind him than Burnished Gold did. The reins loosened against Finish's neck, and he snapped out of his thoughts. Now wasn't the time to worry. Now was the time to run with all of his strength. The worries were left behind him on the track as he sprinted forward, making one step, then another, then another. Even the sound of his jockey's breathing faded away as his pulse thudded in his ears. The announcer's voice rang out, and the horse recognized the phrase "racing to finish," which seemed to be associated with him somehow. The gelding felt his heart skip a beat. It had happened. The announcer had called his name first. Pride in himself swelled as he felt his jockey's hand pat his neck, heard her words of encouragement. But wait, something was off. Why was her voice trembling? Had he done something wrong? But the announcer had called his name first. Finish looked around at the crowd to see if they had noticed. They all looked sad too. A few were even crying openly. It happened sometimes after a race, of course, but not this many humans. Even the announcer sounded shaken. Was something bad happening to the humans? Would it happen to his jockey? Dimly, Finish noticed that his jockey was guiding him into a slow walk, and forced himself to focus on the steps. The idea of getting sprayed down and eating some carrots did make him feel better. It wasn't good to introduce all this strange tension into a horse's routine, so the typical post-race walk helped him swish away his worries. After returning to his stall and having his legs checked by the grooms, Finish was refreshed and in somewhat better spirits, though his jockey still hadn't brought him any carrots. The other horses seemed to be feeling similarly. No one, Finish included, felt up to sniffing noses. Finish's ears swiveled as the barn door opened. He recognized the familiar form of his jockey and the smell of fresh carrots. She walked over to him and offered him one, and Finish bit into it joyfully. The rich, earthy taste of the carrot was just as enjoyable as the way it crunched between his teeth. Finish ate one, then another, before finally running out of carrots. When he looked up, he saw his jockey staring at him with tears in her eyes. Finish wasn't sure what to do, so he mouthed at the back of her shirt and was surprised when she rewarded him with a hug. She was trembling, and her tears were warm against his short fur. It made his heart race, and he would have bolted if he had anywhere to go. Finish was trembling too now. The sound of boots crunching into dirt made both horse and human flinch. The steps were heavier than a jockey's. Was the groom or vet here? It wasn't time yet, and the newcomer had an odd, smoky smell. Finnish looked over and saw that the stranger had a pattern on his clothing which made his outline confusing. The man's eyes were hidden by some sort of strange, shiny hat. Finnish didn't like that at all. It seemed like his jockey didn't like it either. Her body language reminded him of how he had felt the first time he was harnessed. The stranger said something in a gruff voice, and the jockey's shoulders slumped. She put a hand on Finish's nose and looked into his eyes. Slowly, reluctantly, she drew her hand away and looked at the barn floor. Finish watched as she followed the stranger out of the barn, dragging her feet in the dirt. Finish didn't get much sleep that night. He felt too jumpy. But at least he would be visited by the grooms. Maybe they would give him carrots as well. Finish's ears were pricked toward the door to the barn, and he could see a few other horses doing the same. As time passed and the barn door stayed closed, the mood in the barn began to sour. Finish pawed at the dirt and dropped his head onto the wooden door of his stall. Suddenly, the squeal of a frightened horse made Finish echo the cry. When he had calmed down a bit, Finish looked around to see what had happened. A chestnut gelding a few stalls away had hit the door of his stall with his hoof, and it had opened. Had the humans left the doors ajar? Finish saw a mare nudge her stall door open. That was it, then. Finish himself refused to open the door. It had been, mostly, closed by his jockey, and so that meant she wanted him to stay in his stall, so he would stay in his stall. Finish rested his head on the door and sighed, ears perked for the sound of human footsteps. Days came and went. Horses left their stalls, went back into them, tried the barn door to no success except for the clang of hooves on metal. Finish had always been a slow eater, so he still had hay in his net, though he had had to bare his teeth at a few of his barn mates in order to keep it. There was a metallic click. Finish looked up, heart racing. The door to the barn opened, bringing with it the scent of falling leaves and cold air. There was no smell of humans, nor any silhouettes against the light. The hope died in Finish's heart, and he dropped his head back against the door with a sigh. The tale of the humans heard. Bella raised her head into the breeze, enjoying the feeling of the wind in her mane. The snow had melted at long last. She had thought the winter would never end. The mares hadn't been bothered by it, though, so snow must not be too dangerous. Now that the snow was gone, the forage tasted better than it ever had, and that was good. Bella lowered her head to it, savoring the dewy flavor of the yet unopened flower buds. A friendly whinny told her she was not the only one who was in a good mood. The speckled nose of a filly about the same age as Bella appeared on her left. Of all of Bella's half-sisters, Stella was definitely her closest friend, and Bella gave her a happy, short whinny. Bella pressed her nose into the white fur of Stella's back. She didn't feel like playing chase around the pasture. Thankfully, Stella obliged, nibbling gently at Bella's mane. No horse currently alive on HCS 67 had ever seen an external parasite, but instincts would take far longer to go extinct. After a little while, Bella heard a human voice calling her name. Stella stepped back, and Bella looked up. The snow was finally melting off of the black paths, and she heard human footsteps on them. The oldest of the teenagers that took care of her, his chin beginning to grow fur, was walking over to the pasture with an odd bundle of ropes in one hand and an apple in the other. Now that she thought about it, she hadn't seen any of the adult humans around lately. Bella trotted over to him. The boy stepped into the pasture, locking the gate behind him, then held the ropes up to Bella's nose. She sniffed them. They were slightly darker in color than the grass and had metal circles. The boy touched her head and put the rope behind her ears and across the bridge of her nose. It was scary, but the human's voice was reassuring, and Bella dimly remembered something like this happening a while ago before she had finished weaning. The boy pulled his hands back, and Bella tried to pull her head away only to be jerked back. When she turned, she could see a rope leading from her to the boy's hand. The boy spoke soothingly to her again and held out his left hand, which was holding the apple. She could smell that it was nice and juicy, though a little cold from being recently unfrozen. She sniffed at it before biting into it, savoring the crisp crunchiness. Once she had finished it, the boy patted her gently and removed the halter. Bella was only too eager to run back to the mares and do some more grazing. They didn't seem particularly bothered. A few were placidly eating from the hay hut, so Bella looked around for Stella. The boy was adjusting the halter around her head. Once he had let Stella go, Bella ran over to her, nudging her shoulder and hoping for a game of chase around the pasture. Stella obliged, and Bella dashed toward the fence, feeling the wind flowing through her mane. A warning glance from the lead mare, Sasha, directed Bella back toward the middle of the pasture. Bella hadn't meant to almost run into her. Stella caught up a few moments later, and Bella quickly forgot about the older Appaloosa's admonitions. A few days later, Bella was out grazing again when she was called over by the boy. Maybe he had another apple. Bella trotted over and reluctantly allowed him to put the halter on. To her surprise, he opened the gate and led her through before latching it again. The boy seemed to be leading her toward the barn, and as they got closer, she recognized a teenage girl who lived in a different house on the farm. She was sitting on a stool and holding some sort of implement. The boy called out to her, his voice loud and gruff. The girl sat up a little and raised a hand in the air. The boy seemed to puff up and walked over, tying Bella's rope to a loop in the barn. Why was he acting so brash? The girl picked up Bella's foot, which she had learned to accept. It clicked when she saw the metal hook in the girl's hand. They were going to clean her hooves. That was fine by her. It was stressful to have to hold her hoof up, but she was looking forward to having the mud removed. The humans talked among themselves, sitting oddly close together. Occasionally, they traded off who was cleaning the hooves and who was reassuring Bella. It didn't matter much to her as long as her hooves were clean and trimmed. At last, her hooves were clean, and Bella could tell that she was much more relieved than the humans were. Slowly, the boy untied Bella from the loop and headed back toward the pasture. Once she was back in the pasture, feeling the grass under her hooves, the boy pulled the halter off of her head. The sun stayed in the sky longer these days, creeping up over the mountains that sparkled at night, so there was still plenty of grazing time. She heard the boy's footsteps fading before the door of the farmhouse closed. Bella sniffed at the forage. The dew was long since gone, but it was still deliciously firm. She was about to take a big bite when an unimaginable sound filled her ears. It was like the growl of one of the farm dogs, but much louder. What was that? Bella glanced at Sasha, who was looking up, ears showing annoyance but not concern. Sasha's spots were chestnut, but why did they look black, and why did her white fur look gray? They weren't in their stalls, so nothing could be casting a huh? A black object, not a storm cloud, it was too solid and regular in shape, obscured the sun, moving across the sky in a straight line. Bella watched as it moved toward the shiny mountains, where the black paths led to. The purposefulness in its movements reminded her of a bee. Sasha sighed and went back to feeding from the hay hut, so Bella did as well. Whatever it was, it must not be something she needed to worry about. Bella was hoping to be able to play with Stella the next day, but she saw that Stella had been put in halter by the girl. On the bright side, not running around would mean that her hooves wouldn't get muddy again. Bella chose to content herself by looking past the familiar spotted forms of the other horses and even past the peeling fence of her pasture. Open windows from the farmhouse let out the savory scent of cooking vegetables. The sounds of the other horses and the chatter of the humans from the barn and farmhouses soothed her ears. The angular forms of the mountains, the tall looming ones rather than the ones that glowed at night, reached up to touch the fluffy clouds. The tops reminded her of the white fur of the horses of her herd and blended in with the clouds. The girl brought Stella back, and Bella pranced up to her. Stella snorted, joining in the playful prancing. Stella moved away, breaking into a run, and Bella followed, feeling the tickling of the clover and flower sprouts against the frogs of her hooves. Stella ran toward the middle of the pasture, away from the mares. The farm dogs started barking, snapping Bella and Stella out of their game. It sounded like there was a trailer on the black path, but when Bella turned to look at it, it didn't look like any trailer she'd ever seen. It was all smooth lines with no room for even a young horse. It didn't belong to any of the humans she knew. It stopped moving, and 3 strange, strong-looking humans got out of it. After not hearing or seeing any adult humans for so long, their sudden reappearance was startling. These weren't the usual adults who lived on the farm, either. All of the strangers wore odd clothing that made their outlines confusing. They moved purposefully toward the farmhouse, and one of the women called out sharply. The door opened. The boy's bearded face appeared, brows furrowed. The expression on his face changed from wariness to worry as he talked to the 3 strangers, nodding at something they said. The boy gestured toward the other farmhouse before closing the door. Bella could hear him saying something to the younger humans while the strangers headed toward the other farmhouse. As they passed the pasture, Bella sniffed. They had a smoky smell that was completely unfamiliar, and she backed away, accidentally bumping into Stella's shoulder. When all the young humans were clustered together, they seemed worried. The youngest were crying openly, while the teenage boy and the adult humans tried to reassure them. The teenage girl looked resigned, holding tightly onto the boy's hand. They were speaking in quiet voices. The man held the door of the trailer open. The boy got into the trailer, but the girl let go of the boy's hand and said something to the man, who nodded. Bella stared at her with flared nostrils as the girl approached the pasture. The girl fiddled with the lock, and the gate swung open with a creak. Bella skittered away, looking to Sasha for reassurance and seeing out of one eye Stella do the same. The lead mare seemed just as alarmed as Bella felt, standing still, muscles tensed and eyes fixed on the retreating figure of the girl. Bella followed her gaze, watching the girl get into the trailer and hearing the door slam shut. Lights flicked on along the sides of the trailer, and it sped away, heading along the black paths towards the shiny mountains. The soft clump of Sasha's hooves on the grass made Bella jump. She was sniffing at the gate, and the whole herd was watching her to see if going through it was safe. In all Bella's short life, the gate had never been left open when the humans were not around. Sasha looked around, listening for something that Bella did not understand. She took one step toward the gate, then another, until she had walked through it. A few of the mares, including Bella's mother, followed her, their hooves hard on the black paths. Bella took a few steps forward before looking back at Stella. Stella hung back, pawing at the grass with flattened ears. Bella wondered what she could do to encourage her half-sister. If Sasha felt the black paths were safe, then that was good enough for Bella. Bella gave her a friendly whinny, prancing over to the gate. Stella took a tentative step forward. Bella pranced back to her, and they walked through the gate side by side. The black path was solid under Bella's hooves, nowhere near as comfortable as the pasture. It was strange being outside of the pasture without her halter on. She kept expecting a human to appear, but none did. Bella and Stella decided to stay close to Sasha, as it seemed many of the mares had figured was a good idea. The lead mare had made her way to the barn, and Bella belatedly realized that the hay hut in their pasture had looked empty today. The door was shut, though, and the farm dog lounging outside looked up pointedly. Sasha stared at it before walking away, the herd following. The horses made their way to the stalls. Bella shivered with the memory of sheltering from the snow there. Sasha looked around for a moment before lowering her head to the grass next to the wooden wall. Bella decided to taste the grass as well. It was similar to the grass from the pasture, but she could taste fewer flower sprouts and more clover. Bella found it quite delicious. The gentle nudge of a head against her shoulder caught Bella's attention. She looked up to see Stella, who turned toward the pasture. Sasha had begun to make her way back and was assessing whether the other mares were following. Maybe the humans had refilled the hay huts while she was grazing. She would have heard or smelled them, though. The odd trailer hadn't come back either. The yearlings made their way back to the pasture, the gate of which was still open, in the company of their herd. There were still no humans around, and the hay huts hadn't been refilled. Bella slept uneasily that night. When the sun rose, Bella noticed that the gate was still open. The mares were already awake. The hay huts hadn't been refilled. Bella's instincts squealed at her to stay with her herd, but she herself had never known anything more dangerous than the branding iron that had once sunk into her right shoulder. Bella shifted and tossed her head, trying to decide what to do. A sound that reminded her of a dog's growl at an unimaginable volume split the air. Memory fit into place like a horseshoe into a hoof. Bella looked toward the shiny mountains and saw the massive black shape somehow floating in the air. It was far bigger than any bee, but it still moved just as purposefully. Bella watched as it moved across the sky, briefly obscuring the sun and getting smaller and smaller until it was lost to view. A hoof tapped the chestnut fur of her knee, and she lowered her head to see a familiar speckled nose. Stella pranced away, and Bella followed, the shadow-casting shape fading into a memory. The Tale of the Storm in the City. The dry lot had been odd lately. Paradise sniffed at the tiny jagged mystery growing from the dirt. It was paler in hue than the hay in the net in her stall, but an experimental chomp told her that it was good to eat. Perhaps the humans had put the plants in the dry lot as a treat? That would be odd, as they had never done that for all her years. The sun was higher in the sky, and the air smelled like pollen, so that meant that the humans would come visit soon to check on them. Maybe they would even bring back that handsome gelding. Neither gelding nor humans had been around last spring either. Even more confusingly, no mare in the herd had foaled last year. Paradise couldn't remember that ever happening. In the meantime, there were plants to look for. Paradise sniffed along the ground as she walked across the dry lot, trying to stay out of the way of the other mares in her herd. It seemed like the mechanical help hands had been tending to them as well, since their hooves were neatly trimmed. One of the mares had rolled onto her back for what Paradise knew was the sheer joy of sun on the belly and the pleasant scratch of dirt on the shoulders. Before Paradise had even fully formed the thought, she found herself rolling in the dirt as well, feeling the last of her winter coat shedding away. As Paradise stood back up, she could see the tall, rectangular shapes of the buildings above the horse stalls. 2 autumns ago, she had seen light and the watchful faces of humans through the see-through parts of the building, but now even a horse's superior low-light vision showed lonely darkness. Paradise went back to sniffing for dandelions and, eventually and accidentally, ventured too close to one of her herdmates. An angry snort and a sharp shove sent Paradise away with pinned ears and injured pride. That mare seemed to be unusually annoyed, which Paradise took note of. It wasn't even feeding time, though a rumble in Paradise's stomach told her that dry lot time was almost half over. At least she'd be able to eat in peace. A while later, the automatic stall doors opened with a simultaneous click. All of the horses hurried to whichever stall was closest. The alarm which they knew would play if they overstayed in the dry lot was terrifying. Paradise, too, trotted into the nearest stall, her nose guiding her toward the left side of the far end and its waiting food trough, and her ears dimly registering the click of the stall door closing behind her. Oddly and disappointingly, there was less hay in the stall than there had been yesterday. The spring days blended together. The amount of hay in the food troughs lessened and lessened. The horses grew more restless. Paradise felt an odd yearning for something she didn't understand. The humans and their gelding hadn't reappeared. None of the other mares had had their tails wrapped and cleaned, so the humans hadn't visited them either. It was only a matter of time before a storm broke out, thunder roaring overhead. Rain poured down, turning the dirt of the dry lot into mud. The automated stall doors clicked open for pasture time, but none of the horses moved. Paradise pinned her ears back, swishing her tail and watching the rain hit the mud. Thunder roared again, and there was a crash. The squeal of a horse took Paradise's attention from the other sounds. She shied away, colliding with the wall of her stall. Hooves squelched in the mud. and Paradise recognized the black coat of her herd's lead mare, Cosmic. She had run out of her stall into the rain, which quickly drenched her. Once Cosmic had reached the opposite end of the no longer dry lot, she turned back and stared at her stall with flaring nostrils. Paradise observed with the full attention of eyes, nose, and ears, tuning out the storm. When Cosmic's body language changed from fear to curiosity, it sparked the same emotions in Paradise. The bay mare winced as the cold rain hit her nose. Reluctantly, she ventured into the storm, her hooves sinking into the mud. Paradise kept her head down as she approached Cosmic, and they sniffed nostrils. Since Cosmic stepped toward the stall rather than toward Paradise, the younger mare figured she was allowed to follow her elder and see why she had run into the storm. As they approached Cosmic's stall, Paradise began to become confused. The outside world smelled like pollen and plants, while the inside of a stall smelled like humans and metal. Wind always came from outside, except when the excess hay was blown through the food troughs. Yet, wind was blowing from Cosmic's stall, and it smelled like plants. No wonder she had run. The sight, when she had reached it, shocked Paradise into immobility. The back of the stall had opened, like how the stall door opened onto the dry lot. The object that had fallen on the stall was one she recognized from her yearly trip outside on a guide rope. It reminded her of a piece of hay, only much taller and darker. Paradise turned her head, trying to see around Cosmic. The lead mare stared hard at her, and Paradise quickly dropped her head. Cosmic stepped forward, and Paradise followed close behind, not wanting the door to close and lock her out. She was careful to stay as close as she could without bumping into Cosmic, and ended up standing with her front hooves on the floor of the stall and her back hooves in the mud. They had taken too long. The alarm blared, startling both horses. Cosmic bolted through the opening, and Paradise followed, feeling the bark scratch against her back. Suddenly, they were outside. Paradise stopped, looking around. She had occasionally been outside before, once a year except for last year, when the humans led her to the stall with the cold instruments. It looked a little different than she remembered. The hard, square paths that she remembered were now cracked, plants sprouting from the ruptures. The rain was pelting onto the tall, neatly planted trees, which were still standing with the exception of the one that had fallen on the stall. The only branches were raised high above her head, and she instinctively moved to stand under the nearest for shelter. Nibbling at the bark filled her mouth with a sticky substance, so she quickly stopped doing so. The uniform grass along the sides of the building that had always tempted her in earlier years was now overgrown, a few early flowers bright and inviting. There was no halter around her head and no humans, just Cosmic looking around with raised ears and flared nostrils. If Paradise didn't try it now, she might never get another chance. The mare's nose went down to the feathery tops of the grass. It tasted somehow stringier than hay, yet richer. It thrilled her to her core. Cosmic put her head down too and began to eat. The rain on the grass was refreshing, but Paradise was still thirsty. She looked around, listening to the rain pattering across the roofs of the buildings and along the odd, hard path past the grass. There was another row of trees across from it, as well as some unfamiliar rectangular shape held up by two stumps. Thunder boomed overhead, and Paradise was glad she was sheltering under the tree. It didn't provide as much protection as her stall had, but it was worth it to see what was beyond the dry lot. Though Paradise knew she would be rained on if she moved, she was also curious what was past the trees. She looked to Cosmic for guidance. The older horse had lifted her head and was looking back at the open door. She didn't seem alarmed, so it must be safe. Paradise decided to explore. As she stepped onto the black path, she could smell flowers drinking in the rain. Big buildings loomed up on her left, dark against the setting sun. Some of them had open doors, and a few had a damp, musky smell. For a reason she couldn't understand, the scent made her uneasy. There was no sight, sound, or smell of humans. Paradise looked back at Cosmic. The older mare was staying under the tall tree, watching Paradise carefully. The bay mare lowered her head, obedience overriding her curiosity. Her gaze returned to the area behind the trees, which she could now see was covered in more plants than she'd ever seen. Paradise's whole being ached to roll around in them. Cosmic began walking over, only to suddenly freeze in place. Paradise followed her gaze and felt fright grip her as well. A light had come on in one of the houses. Paradise strained her vision, but none of the rectangular shapes she could see, as the see-through part was rather small and high up, inside the building had moved. This was one of the buildings with an open door, from which the musky smell was coming. Thunder rolled again. Nothing larger than a leaf moved. Paradise hardly dared to blink the water from her eyes. Yet, eventually, the horses relaxed slightly. Cosmic turned, moving closer to the door of her stall. Paradise lifted her head and looked back at the field. Much closer than the thunder came the click of unfamiliar feet on asphalt and the hiss of indrawn breath. Paradise ripped her gaze from the field. 3 strange beings, neither human nor horse, had slunk out from the building from which the light had come. The beasts had fur almost as long as a horse's mane, with gray backs and white bellies to varying degrees. They stared up at Paradise with pinned-back ears and horrible, forward-facing eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of human eyes. Their drenched feet were furry, ending in sharp, miniature hooves, which must have been what clicked on the path. If they were standing, she guessed their heads would be level with her hocks, but they were crouching, lips pulled back and showing sharp teeth. Paradise couldn't pull her eyes away from the creatures. Her legs trembled. One of the beasts tried to step towards her, but a low, angry call burst from one of its companions. The horror of that sound bit through the fear that had frozen her hooves. Paradise galloped toward the field. With her left eye, she saw the black blur that was Cosmic running back into her stall. It didn't register to the thinking part of her mind, nor did the beauty of the field she was racing through. Paradise's attention was on the creatures panting behind her and the broken city ahead of her. The black path to what a human would have called the southwest looked like it would provide surer footing. Paradise turned toward it, the shadow of the trees flashing across her back. The buildings on either side of the path were smaller than the only one she knew. As a horse, she could see further behind herself as she ran than a human could. Relief filled her when she saw her pursuers fading into the distance behind the corner of one of the smaller buildings. Paradise, unused to such strenuous activity, slowed to a walk and looked around, the rain washing the sweat from her skin. Rain pattered down on the angular roofs around her, reminding her of her thirst. She was unpleasantly aware of her isolation, too. Cosmic hadn't followed her, and Paradise didn't dare go back to look for her. Since the buildings to her sides had fences around their yards, and she couldn't go back, Paradise turned her attention to the environment in front of her. It was another open field, ringed by plants that were smaller than trees but taller than grass. Paradise walked up and sniffed at one, only to be poked in the nose by the twigs. Yet, now that she was closer, she could hear a splashing sound that was deeper than rain hitting the ground. Paradise looked around, seeing a roughly circular patch of ground which was filled with water. Somehow, confusingly, the water was going up for a short distance, only to fall back down again. To make sure that it wasn't dangerous, Paradise flipped up her lip and took a deep sniff, letting the wet air pass against her vulvaronasal organ. An unexpected smell made her heart skip a beat. A horse! The scent didn't belong to one of the members of her herd. Instead, it reminded her of the human's gelding, only somehow more potent. She found herself wanting to meet this strange horse. It took substantial effort to push her excitement to the side long enough to drink her fill. When she had, she let out a hopeful whinny. The other horse whinnied back, and she noted that the stranger had a deep, booming voice that sounded quite nice. A quick glance behind her showed Paradise that the beasts hadn't reappeared. She fixed the attention of eyes and ears on the stranger, who had been sheltering from the storm in a building across the field and was walking over. The horse, clearly male, was strong-looking, with a muscular neck and had seal-brown fur except for the legs, nose, and parts of the barrel, which were white. The horse, clearly male, was strong-looking, with a muscular neck and had seal-brown fur except for the legs, nose, and parts of the barrel, which were white. Somehow, it felt incorrect to think of him as a gelding, though that was the only adult male horse she'd ever met. The stallion, though Paradise lacked the word, pranced over to her. Paradise nuzzled her muzzle against his, exulting in the joy of grass under her hooves and a handsome companion by her side. The Tale of the Strange Migration. Croaker was a creature of dim intellect, but she could tell that it was colder now. The menhaden would move south, and so her kind, the striped bass, would move south as well. She was large enough now that she could stay on the shoreward edge of her school, which had its perks and its dangers. She'd be able to see any shrimp or other food, but that was how she'd acquired the irritating hook that was still lodged in her lip. Though Croaker hadn't gotten hooked this year, nor had she seen any other fish get hooked. There had been hooks when she was much younger, but since she'd become large, there hadn't been any. Swimming above that, this year's spawning season had been unusual too. In the oceans there were her kind and those they ate, both menhaden and sand shrimp. The rivers, however, belonged to the striped bass alone. Not anymore. There had been odd oval creatures that moved without fins. Even worse, these creatures were dangerous. They had no jaws, but somehow they still pierced a fish's scales. Croaker had thankfully been spared, but her lateral line had flashed countless warnings from the frantic swimming of her schoolmates. The oval creature's victims were left weakened, sometimes too much so to hunt, and the attackers clung to them until they reached salt water. At least the few creatures that had fallen off of the fish when that happened had been good to eat. But such worries didn't occupy Croaker's mind much. There was a more pressing concern. The journey south was long, and the water was cold. Too cold. It had never been this cold before this early in the migration. She felt so slow in the fins, and the whole school barely moved. They had to reach the warm currents, and soon. The Tale of the Old One's Young Shadow. Calfar had never seen anyone as fascinating as the lead mare of his herd. Granted, he was only 5 months old. Almost all of his experiences were with his herd, though Calfar had seen the white-furred shapes of other horses at times. It would have been difficult to avoid them. There were many other herds in the rolling grassy hills that were his home. When they got too close, though, his father usually chased them away. Calfar didn't understand why, but he didn't care very much either. Calfar would much rather admire the leader of his herd. Like most other horses he'd seen, she had snow-colored fur and striped hooves. There were a few chestnut spots along her flanks, head, and neck, and her knees were chestnut along with parts of her tail. The leader, Calfar's parents, and some of the older mares had long-heeled slashing scars across their legs. Those didn't seem to match the little oval creatures that sometimes bit the horses when they drank water and clung to them briefly afterward. But there was something different about the leader that set her aside from the rest of the herd. She was sturdier than the others, despite the slowness that came from great age, as if she had grown up eating more nutritious food. The leader's scent, too, had a certain richness to it. Also unusual was the ancient wide scar on her right shoulder. It seemed too deep and regular to be natural. Calfar often wondered what had caused it, but he had no language with which to ask her. The leader was grazing in the tall grass, as were many of the other horses. Calfar sidled up to her in order to feed nearby. The leader glanced at him, but didn't shoo him away. Calfar lowered his head to the grass, which he was still getting used to eating. It tasted good, and the summer sun made it pleasantly dry, but Calfar was not yet old enough for grazing to provide all of his nutrition. Instinct guided him to stop after a little while and search elsewhere for sustenance. The leader was still eating, though her slightly cloudy eyes searched the landscape for threats. The foal looked around, seeing the rolling slope of the hill descending into the grass. The bright forms of wildflowers dotted the slope. A few oak trees provided shade, and he saw his mother resting under one at the bottom of the hill. Calfar called out to his mother, and Fastflick returned the gesture. She nuzzled him, and he pressed against her flank. It had been getting colder, but cozying close to another horse always fixed that. Calfar nursed, Fastflick swished her tail. She had a habit of doing that. It was an instinctual behavior, as the parasites that their tails evolved to swat away had never existed on this world. That mattered little to Calfar, though he felt his own short tail flicking as well. When he had finished his meal, he looked up at the oak tree overhead. A few of the leaves had an odd, pale, almost see-through hue. It made Calfar nervous. Autumn wasn't something he'd ever heard of or experienced. Fastflick sensed her son's fear, and her soft tongue licked his forehead. It made him feel a lot better. Perhaps the changing colors of the leaves weren't something he needed to be afraid of. Calfar nuzzled his mother again before trotting off in search of his idol. The leader was standing on top of a tall hill, different than the one she had occupied earlier. From his position at the base of the hill, Calfar could see that her ears were focused in the opposite direction from him, toward what a human would have called the west. She didn't seem alarmed, so there must not be any danger. Calfar pranced up with a friendly whinny, and the leader glanced briefly at him before returning her gaze to whatever she was looking at. Curious, Calfar followed her line of sight. To the west was a strange, unnatural land. Unnervingly regular objects, which he could only think of as large rocks, had been climbed by leafy vines. Somehow these rocks stood straight up without sloping like the mountains. Regular parts of them were see-through in an uncomfortably deliberate and unknown pattern. Calfar's heart raced. He looked away, toward the ground of the strange place. The familiar, reassuring shapes of shrubs broke up the imposing black paths. The midday sun glinted off of an oddly rectangular small lake, around which a few young chestnut trees reached up to the sky. The whole scene scared Calfar, and he pressed close to the leader. She had been lost in some memory, but snapped back to her senses at the foal's touch, snorting in surprise. The leader nudged him gently toward the other side of the hill, away from the strange place and toward the natural world, which was all he knew. Thanks for watching. In the next episode, we'll explore tales from when the inhabitants of HCS-67 begin to more fully expand their ranges in a world free of human interference, starting at 50 YAA. If you enjoyed this, let me know in the comments or by subscribing to the channel. It really helps. Hope to see you in the next one.